There was little wind that day, but the cold was piercing. The Blackfoot River lay under a thick crust of ice, like a frozen piece of glass. Among the endless snow-covered fields, its sinuous lines seemed the only living element of nature, water hidden under an icy crust, still moving, never at rest. On the outskirts of the town of Grant, around 20 people had gathered at a hole cut into the ice. Men in warm jackets, women in wool coats, children wrapped in hats and scarves that almost completely hid their faces. They stood silently, looking at the dark water covered with a thin film of ice that had to be broken every few minutes. There was a baptism today. The man for whom the ceremony was being performed stood at the edge of the water, his bare feet in the snow. He was taller than most of those present, thin, with short dark hair and strangely intense features. No one in the locals knew him well, but they all remembered that he had arrived in town 3 months earlier, rented a trailer on the outskirts, and barely spoke to his neighbors. However, he had been a regular at Sunday services, and when the pastor asked him to be baptized, he had accepted without hesitation. The pastor, an elderly man with gray temples and expressive eyes, held a worn Bible in his hands, its pages damp with snow grains stuck to the cover. He said a prayer, crossing the man in front of him. The man did not take his eyes off the water, his lips trembling, either from the cold or from excitement. Among the assembled were the Millers, John and Catherine, and their 16-year-old daughter Hannah. They stood apart, not wanting to attract attention. John folded his arms over his chest, watching with a slight strain. Catherine clutched a prayer book, and Hannah, cold and slightly distant, kept her eyes on the water. The pastor came closer and motioned for the man to step into the hole. He took a step, wincing from the cold, but did not stop. The water rose to his knees, then to his thighs. The movement caused small waves to break against the edges of the ice. Those who were standing closer could see the change in his expression as the water reached his chest. It seemed as if fear was reflected in his eyes. Not just the discomfort of the cold, but something else, something deeper. The pastor raised his hand. At that moment, the first shot rang out. A dull, sharp sound that echoed across the frozen river made everyone jump. People froze, and then panic set in. Some screamed, some threw themselves to the ground, not understanding where the danger came from. John Miller grabbed his wife's hand, and she dropped her prayer book into the snow. Hannah froze, her heart pounding, but she still didn't move, her gaze fixed on the water. The second shot rang out immediately after the first. The pastor, who had held his hand up just a moment ago, now fell to his knees, his body convulsing forward and sliding into the water. Blood mixed with the blackness of the river, spreading out into a scarlet cloud. The screams turned into chaos. People ran to their cars, some fell, slipping on the ice. John Miller, without looking back, pulled his wife toward the car, but Hannah did not move. Her gaze was fixed on the ice hole. The pastor's body had already sunk into the water, disappearing into the depths, but there, among the ripples and the growing blood stain, she saw something else. At first it seemed to her like a trick of the light, but then the shape became discernible. A face looking out from under the water. Woman, eyes wide open as if trying to say something, lips moving. Or was it just the current? Third shot. Something sharp pierced the shoulder of the man standing in the water. He staggered, tried to grab the edge of the ice, but his fingers slipped and he went under. Hannah could barely breathe. The shooter lay in the snow, his body motionless. Blood was spreading across the white blanket. Someone had shot him. But who? Hannah's hands were shaking. The ice hole in front of her was empty. The icy water hid everyone who fell in there. The fog lay like a thick blanket over the city, muffling even the harshest sounds. The street lamps barely pierced this curtain, their light blurred in the air as if it itself was losing its strength. The wind walked between the wooden houses, bringing with it the cold and the smell of melted snow. The old Chevy pulled slowly into the Miller's driveway. The car skidded twice on the frozen pavement, but the driver kept his cool, keeping a firm grip on the wheel. He didn't say a word. No one said a word. There was silence inside the car. The woman in the front seat stared ahead, her knuckles white. The girl in the back seat sat motionless, her gaze riveted on her own hands, folded in her lap. Fragments of memories flashed through her mind. Black water, crimson streaks on the ice, a face receding into the darkness. The man turned off the engine, paused behind the wheel, took a deep breath. Then he got out first, looked around the street, checking for strangers. Several windows in the neighboring houses were still lit. Someone was awake, but no one looked outside. On this night, everyone preferred to stay in their homes. The car door opened again. The woman quickly walked inside, trying not to linger on the threshold. The girl in the back seat did not move. Her breathing was ragged. Her heart was beating faster than it should have. The images in her head were becoming clearer. Her hands clutched her jacket convulsively. The cold receded as someone leaned toward her, but the movement brought no relief. A moment later she looked up and, gathering her strength, climbed out. The house greeted them with a dead silence. The smell of a cold dinner mixed with a barely perceptible smell of dust. The man took off his jacket, casually hung it on the back of a chair, walked into the room, stopping in front of a shelf with bottles. He poured himself some whiskey, drained the glass in one gulp and froze, staring at one point. The woman turned on the stove and put on water. The match trembled in her fingers as she brought the flame to the burner. The girl remained at the threshold. The echo of gunshots rang in her head. They were sharp, but something was missing. Two sounds came from one point, a third from another. There was a flicker of movement in the room. The man turned his head, hunched over a little more. There was a phone on the table in front of him. No one was calling, but he knew it would ring. 10 miles away, the gray walls of the office seemed even duller under the light of the desk lamp. The papers on the desk were laid out in strict order. The pencil lay to one side, as if the thought it was supposed to record had already lost its meaning. The printout had 3 names written in neat lines. The first name belonged to the pastor. The body was pulled from the water almost an hour after the incident. The gunshot wound was clear, but death was caused by drowning. The second name belonged to a man who was being baptized. He drowned. The wound on his body was not deep, but he did not get out. The third name belonged to the shooter. The body was found in the snow. The head wound left him no chance. The sheet of paper remained motionless, but the gaze above it grew sharper. The whole scene was chaotic, but in this chaos, there was an order that should not be there. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled. Outside the city windows, the air thickened even more. The night on the outskirts of Grant was slow, like the thick fog that enveloped the town. Beyond the main streets, where a few streetlights still pierced the haze, lay endless fields, bare trees, and lonely farmhouses surrounded by snow. Route 47, the one that led to the river, was almost empty. The asphalt was covered with an icy crust, and along the shoulder there was a narrow strip of packed snow, dotted with tire and boot tracks. There shouldn't have been anyone there at 3 in the morning, but someone was there. The dim light from the headlights briefly illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the road. Tall and wrapped in a long, dark coat, she looked like a shadow in the night. Her head was slightly lowered, her face hidden by a hood. The car drove past without slowing down, but the driver still turned around, glancing in the rearview mirror. A second later, the figure was no longer there. The sheriff's office was still. The single working heater hummed, filling the room with a faint, barely perceptible warmth. The papers on the sheriff's desk were untouched, their edges curled slightly from the moisture in the air. 3 names were still written on one page, each one haunting. Sheriff Blaine sat at his desk, leaning back in his chair. His eyes were closed, but he was not asleep. His temples throbbed with heaviness. He recalled the call that morning, the one that had woken him before dawn. The voice on the other end was hoarse, worried. The words were simple. Someone was shooting by the river. After that, everything started spinning too fast. When he arrived at the scene, people had already crowded onto the shore. Some had managed to pull out bodies. Some kept repeating that they had seen nothing but splashes in the water. Some looked away. Some crossed themselves. The tracks in the snow spoke louder than the people. 3 bodies, 3 shots, but there were more than 3 prints on the ground. The ones that led to the water matched. They were left by 2 people, the pastor and the man he baptized. The ones that ran away belonged to the shooter. But there was another chain. It went parallel, away from the main tracks, then turned sharply. It led to the forest. These tracks were clear, left by a confident but quick gait. Whoever it was, he was the first to leave before the 3rd shot rang out. The sheriff remembered where they ended. A few miles from the city, among the bare trees, an old hunting cabin almost merged with the dark forest. Its walls had long since darkened with time, cracked in places, but the roof held firmly, and the door was securely locked from the inside. Inside there was a smell of old wood, burnt firewood, and a barely perceptible dampness. On the table lay a pistol, neatly, evenly, as if it had been placed there carelessly, but with a specific purpose. There was a lantern nearby, its glass covered with a thin layer of soot. In the corner hung a jacket, soaked with the smell of tobacco and something metallic. The man in the chair sat motionless, his head bowed. In the lamplight his face was in shadow, but the hand resting on the armrest was tense. He heard the snow crunch outside the window. 1 step, then another. The one outside moved carefully. Pause. The hut remained silent, but the air inside thickened, as if it had become denser. The footsteps resumed, but now they were going away. A moment later, a barely audible rustling of branches was heard outside, and the forest was once again silent. The man at the table did not move. Only after a few minutes did he slowly reach for the weapon, check the magazine, and put it back. He knew that this night would not be the last. Snow continued to fall on the ground in small, unhurried flakes. The city froze, immersed in viscous anticipation. Highway 47, which led to the river, remained empty for most of the day. Only rare headlights of cars cut through the darkness, leaving behind long glare on the icy asphalt. Sheriff Blaine walked slowly along the beach, peering carefully at the tracks that had not yet disappeared under the fresh snow. The tracks were washed out, partly trampled. Too many people had been here in the last few days, but he was not looking for ordinary prints. He was looking for something else. There was thin ice on the river's surface in places, but closer to the center the water was still black, heavy, viscous. The spot where the bodies had been found was marked with yellow tape, but even without it, Blaine knew where to look. The water there was always deeper than it looked. On the shore, at the very edge where the snow turned into dirty, moisture-soaked earth, he lingered. 3 shots, 3 deaths, 3 names. But if it was murder and suicide, as everyone else said, then why were there so many redundant leads in this case? The sheriff thought back to the footsteps that led into the woods. He knew there was someone else here that night, someone who had left first. The Miller's house was the same as it had always been, wooden, sturdy, with small windows and a slanted porch. It stood on the outskirts of town, slightly off the main road, surrounded by bare trees. It was warm inside. The light bulb above the kitchen table flickered dimly, casting soft shadows on the walls. The young girl sitting on the chair seemed almost like a statue. Her hands were on her knees. Her back was straight. Her gaze was directed at one point. She remembered the coldness of the water. I remembered how the ice crunched under someone else's steps, how the metal sparkled. She didn't want to remember, but her memory clung to every detail. There was movement nearby. Heavy steps, measured and confident. The man in the corner poured himself another glass of whiskey and took a slow sip. He wasn't looking in her direction, but she felt his presence. It was too quiet in the house. The silence was oppressive, pulling, leading back, there to the river. Her fingers tightened. She saw the snow around her turning red. How water absorbs the body, tearing it from your hands, carrying it into the depths. She saw the shooter's face. but I only remembered the eyes of the one who stood aside, who saw everything but did not stop. The cabin in the woods remained untouched. The man inside barely moved. Only the shadow of the kerosene lamp swayed on the wall, playing with soft outlines. He knew the sheriff would find his tracks. I knew that the moment would come when the door would swing open and a silhouette in uniform would appear in the doorway. But that moment has not yet come. He closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of old wood, burning and cold metal. That night came back to him again. He remembered the sound of gunshots. I remembered how the snow absorbed the blood. I remembered how the steps disappeared into the darkness. But most of all, he remembered the girl's eyes. She saw him, and he saw her. And that meant that one day she would remember his name. The town of Grant greeted the morning with a silent emptiness. The clouds hung heavily over the rooftops. The sky had acquired a dirty gray hue, and the snow that had just begun to cover the streets seemed dead. Frost crept through the windows, snaked along the walls of houses, penetrated into other people's thoughts. Sheriff Blaine hadn't slept a wink all night. In his dimly lit office, he sat at his desk, absent-mindedly staring at the papers stacked neatly. He knew the contents of each sheet, but there was no point in reading them. His thoughts were elsewhere. 3 bodies, 3 shots, 3 names. On paper, everything looked logical, even fit into a sequence of events. But the sheriff's intuition told him that this was not a simple murder followed by suicide, as everyone was rushing to conclude. There were too many traces, too many shadows left in the case, and among them, one in particular haunted him. Mary Miller, the girl who found herself by the river that night. She didn't run, didn't hide. She just stood there and watched. She was the first one to be found, but there was no fear or shock in her eyes, just a strange, intense awareness of something she chose not to talk about. Mary woke up long before dawn, but she was in no hurry to get out of bed. She lay motionless, staring at the ceiling. It was cold in the house, but she didn't feel it. Her fingers were icy, like that night by the river. She remembered how the snow under her feet absorbed something dark and sticky. She remembered how the water moved quietly, how scarlet streaks spread across its surface. But the look that was etched into her memory most of all was the look. Not the one that froze in the dead eyes of the drowned, but another one, conscious, alive, studying her. She knew that she was not alone that night. Someone was watching what was happening. Someone remained in the shadows, not interfering, but absorbing every second of what happened. This person left first, leaving her there, alone with the dead bodies and the icy water. 10 miles outside of town, in the woods, stood an old hunting cabin. Outside, the kerosene lamp still burned, casting a dim light on the walls. Inside, a man sat motionless on the edge of his bed, hunched over, warming his hands by the small fireplace. He was in no hurry to leave the shelter, but he knew his time was running out. The sheriff was looking for him, Mary too, and soon one of them would find him first. He closed his eyes, thinking back to that night. He heard the muffled sound of gunfire again, smelled the wet earth, saw the bodies swallowed by the water. He didn't know their names, their stories, but he knew it was inevitable. Some people are born to die, some to watch, and some to keep secrets. He had always been one of the third, but this time the secret was too deep. The snow had stopped falling, leaving only a heavy, sticky silence. The town of Grant, already quiet, seemed deserted. People, as if obeying an invisible sign, were in no hurry to leave their homes unless absolutely necessary. No one spoke out loud, but anxiety was in the air. Everyone knew about the bodies found by the river. Everyone knew that Sheriff Blaine had not closed the case, although he had reason to do so. Blaine himself couldn't say exactly what was holding him back from filing his final report. The evidence was coming together, but there was a feeling inside him, a dull, persistent, unpleasant one. He reread the reports. He looked at the photographs. He replayed the events of that night in his head over and over again. 3 dead, 1 surviving witness, 1 possible suspect who still remained in the shadows. Mary Miller had become the key figure in the case, but the sheriff knew that she was slipping further and further away from him with each passing day. The girl avoided unnecessary conversations, stopped going to work, and almost never left the house. Her descriptions of events did not change, but Blaine did not believe in coincidence. Someone was watching her, that was obvious. And, apparently, she knew about it too. On the outskirts of town, in a rotting house that had long been abandoned, life still flickered. The man in the shadows was in no hurry to leave his shelter. He knew that his days of freedom were numbered, but to leave too soon would mean leaving behind unfinished business. He knew that the sheriff was on his trail. He knew that Mary was looking for him, even though she didn't fully realize it. She intuitively knew that whoever was by the river hadn't gone far. He remembered her look that night. She noticed him too, and now an invisible thread stretched between them. But the main question remained open. When would it end? Blaine knew the truth was out there. He knew all the knots of this story were converging on one point, and he was too close to stop. One last effort was all that was left, and then he would either get to the truth or get completely lost in the labyrinth of other people's secrets. The darkness in Grant was different, not threatening but pervasive. Even after the snow had stopped falling, the air was thick and heavy, as if it were pressing down on anyone who dared to disturb it. Time stretched out here, and the emptiness became more and more palpable. Every window seemed like an eye watching the streets, empty of people, but with traces. Traces that no one was in a hurry to erase. Dark corners of houses hid things that even the bravest would prefer to forget. Sheriff Blaine increasingly felt like every step he took brought him closer to the moment when he would either open his eyes or close them forever. He spent long hours in the archive, sorting through old papers, looking for new evidence. And now, finally, his efforts began to bear fruit. Was the truth really that simple? This place, this city, were more than just a place for investigation. Blaine realized that his role in this story had long been more than just the role of an observer. He had become part of this web, and each new fact was like a weak thread that someone was pulling, forcing him to move on. Fragmented memories of that night by the river kept coming back to him. Frank blood, icy waters, and alien faces that floated and vanished as suddenly as their shadows. One body, then another, and fewer questions. But each step forward opened up new ones, questions that had no answers. He had found what he was looking for, but the more he learned, the further the truth seemed to drift from him. He couldn't even figure out what scared him most, that he might be one step away from exposing everything, or that he would never know the full truth anyway. Mary Miller continued to live in her shadow. Blaine knew she knew there was more going on than just chance. She felt her life and her own steps heading in a direction no one could hear anymore. But she wasn't ready to face what she could see if she dared. Every glance she gave him became more threatening, even though no one dared come close. She was a part of it, and she didn't even realize how much. Blaine began to understand that all the actions of this woman, all her behavior, were simply a reflection of those fears that had not left her since that night by the river. The shadows did not go away, but grew longer and darker. Mary understood that it was not over. She knew that all this was still ahead, and no matter how she tried to return to normal life, her steps again led her to where there were already others, obscured by fears and fog. He knew she was the key. She was connected to what was happening in the city, and he couldn't ignore her. But Blaine was overcome with anxiety, that the more he learned about her, the further he was getting from the answer. Or maybe she was the truth he couldn't forget. Every time he looked at her, he became more and more anxious. He couldn't imagine what would happen next. He couldn't understand what would happen if they met those who had long since died. He believed that the only thing he had to do was find her before she disappeared completely, and before that, find whoever was behind all of this. Someone was out there, and Blaine knew it. He knew she would be looking, and she would be alone. Grant was silent, and now it was all part of him, the city, the people, the shadows, the fears. The morning in Grant began as such winter mornings usually do, when the world seems frozen at the junction of night and day. The thick fog still clung to the streets, obscuring the outlines of houses and trees, and the chilling air carried the smell of snow and loneliness. The town was too quiet, too slow, and it seemed as if it could remain like this, forever frozen in time, a frozen reality, where events, even the most tragic, recede into the past, as if they had never happened. But something in the air had changed. The silence was no longer calm, it was oppressive. There was still an untold story in Grant's heart, and now all who dared to seek answers were drawing closer to its source. Blaine stood on the riverbank, looking at the ice that covered its surface. He knew that this place was the point where all lines converged, where the past and present intertwined, creating a complex web. He could just walk away, leave this town, and forget about everything, but he couldn't. He felt like some unknown force was pulling him here. Everything he had been trying to understand for weeks now seemed clear to him, but at the same time, completely impossible. The shadows he and the others had tried to uncover had always led here, to the river, to the hole. But not only to this place. The river was a symbol, an embodiment of something much larger. It was the boundary between worlds, between life and death, between what could be explained and what must remain hidden. And now, as Blaine looked at the ice, he could see neither the end nor the beginning of this path. Mary Miller stood next to him, her face hidden by the shadow of her hood, her eyes full of something Blaine couldn't name, not fear, not pain. It was almost empty, as if nothing could surprise her anymore, nothing could shake her. She knew. It was obvious. She knew that there was only one thing left for them to do: follow this path to the end. The same path they had been following for weeks, only half aware that the tracks led into the shadows, into something that could not be explained. But now Mary knew that this was not the end. She was not prepared for what might await them beyond this finale. She herself had become part of this story, part of what had once been hidden in the fog. "This was all for a reason," she said, speaking less to the sheriff and more to herself. She didn't look at him, didn't search his eyes for confirmation. She knew he already knew. All the weird stuff they'd been through was part of something much bigger. The first steps toward solving the mystery came when they found records of a closed church, forgotten by almost everyone. But even that wasn't the end. More and more stories emerged, like layers of hardened ice, and in each layer they found more sinister clues. A missing priest, people who had vanished, people who had drowned during a ceremony. Each new fact hinted more and more that Grant was not just a town, but a place where dark forces did not let their victims go. "You realize that all these people were part of something that wasn't supposed to happen," she added, not expecting an answer. Mary herself no longer believed in coincidences. She knew that all these people, these events, they wouldn't just disappear. They would come back, and they had already come back. Time passed. It had been weeks since they had started investigating, but for all of them it had felt like an eternity. The sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had learned had led him to a final moment, but there was no final moment. It was all just one long line that never ended, only continued, and he was part of that path. This was where he belonged. The mystery that had been lurking around them from the start was now solved, but not in the way they thought. The dead had returned. That was a fact they could not deny. But they were not mere victims. These people were part of something that had existed long ago, before the church had disappeared, before the shadows had begun to haunt the city. Blaine thought of Henry Ford, the old man who had tried to warn him several times. He had said that it wasn't that simple, that for some people the town was more than just a place. For some people, Grant was more than just a town. It was a place where forgotten things came back to haunt those who didn't know they existed. Now, standing on the riverbank, Blaine knew these people who had drowned in the hole, they were not victims. They were part of something much older, much more powerful, and perhaps they were part of this place. The shadows in Grant would never go away. They would remain, silent and invisible, like the ice that hid the unknown. Mary stepped aside. Her gaze was calm, almost detached, but there was a determination in it that had not been seen before. This was the last part of her journey, a return to the world from which she could not leave. She walked up to the hole, peering into the icy water, and, as if answering Blaine's unspoken question, whispered, "They'll come back for us if we forget." Sheriff Blaine stood next to her. He looked at the river, at the ice that seemed dead but hid something alive beneath it, stretching somewhere into the depths. He understood that this place would never let go. This place would remember. And its shadows, hiding in the fogs, would not let him forget what happened here. Grant was more than a town. It was a place where the dead did not die, where their shadows, frozen in ice, waited to walk that path again, haunting those who dared to seek answers. The quiet water hid much more than it seemed at first glance. And this story will never end.